Okay, I think we're going to make a start now. I think we do have some colleagues that may still join, but we'll start the event. So good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this online event from the OFS, which is about the consultation on a new approach to the Uni Connect programme, which is for the approach from 2021-22 to 2024-25. So the purpose of this event is to give an opportunity to all of you to further understand the context and the details of the consultation on the new approach to Uni Connect, and to ask us any questions that you might have about the proposals that we have that we've published. You are able to submit questions to us to answer in the Q&A later on. Please do use the Q&A function in Zoom, and then we will take those questions and I will then read them to colleagues for them to be answered during the session. And we will aim to respond to as many questions as we can in the time that we have, although I will say, based on previous experience, we're unlikely to be able to get to them all. But where we have sort of theme questions around particular themes, we will try and produce some FAQs to put on the website after the event. If you are encountering any sort of technical issues or have any technical questions, and you want to speak to a member of the events team, then do submit your question or your comment in the chat function. That will only allow you to speak to members of the OFS team. So unfortunately, you won't be able to discuss the content of the event with other delegates through that function. Also, as is normally the case, this session is being recorded and we will be making it available on the website later on this week. Also, live captions or subtitles are available and can be accessed by clicking on the CC icon in Zoom. So that's pretty much the bulk of the housekeeping that I'm sure most of us are very, very familiar with now, given how long we've been running these kind of events and attending these kind of events. I will shortly be introducing my colleagues to take you through an introduction to the programme and the key proposals in our consultation document. But I just wanted to give something by way of introduction and set the context for what we're doing. So improving access and participation obviously is the OFF's first strategic objective, and so improving equality of opportunity is absolutely core to the work that we do. We want to ensure that students from all backgrounds, but particularly students from underrepresented groups and disadvantaged backgrounds, are able to get into higher education, succeed in their studies while they're there, and then progress into fulfilling lives and careers. Now, we know that opportunities to achieve good educational outcomes are unevenly distributed, with some groups consistently achieving higher outcomes in their sort of pre-higher education qualifications than others. Gaps in educational outcomes between the most and least advantaged young people have long been a feature of our education system, and the fear is that the progress to close those gaps at school level, which had been narrowing, had stalled even prior to the pandemic. And obviously all the indications are that those gaps may have widened as a result of the pandemic, which we are seeing through some of the research that's been coming through more recently. Where young people live is also a key factor on outcomes for young people. So, for example, 55% of young people living in London will enter higher education as opposed to 40% that live in the northeast of England. So place is very important in addressing inequality of opportunity and outcomes, and is recognised by the government and articulated through their levelling up agenda. Ensuring that there are multiple routes or pathways for both young people and adults to access education and learning opportunities are seen as key in supporting local prosperity, addressing local skills needs, and building up the economy. Absolutely critical also, obviously, to social mobility. Providing such opportunities means universities, colleges, schools, employers, charities, LEPs, etc., working together to maximise choice and build the pathways into and through further and higher education that meet the needs of diverse learners and their communities. Now, the OFS supports access and participation in multiple ways. Obviously, we have agreed ambitious access and participation plans, which are required for any university or college that wish to charge higher fees. And this will help bring about transformational change in the access, participation and outcomes for students from currently underrepresented groups. We also provide funding to universities and colleges through our student premiums to help them support students from underrepresented groups successfully participate in higher education and progress into fulfilling careers. We fund innovative activity through our challenge competitions. Most recently, we've funded competitions in mental health. And of course, we run the national Uni Connect programme, which this session today is all about. We are acutely aware of the impact that COVID-19 has had on students and providers, and we know that those impacts have been differentially affecting different communities. It's thrown up significant new challenges in respect of remote delivery of activity and highlighted further inequalities such as access to digital infrastructure and equipment. It's against this backdrop that we are consulting on the future shape of the Uni Connect programme. We see a clear continued need for the programme, a national programme that enables and supports collaborative activity in local areas that can tailor that activity to the needs of local schools and the needs of learners and other stakeholders in those communities. So the focus of the consultation today, Uni Connect was originally designed to run for 4 years up until July 2021. And what we want to do now is to bring it into line with the time frame of the access and participation plans that we've most recently agreed, which are set to run over a 5-year time frame from 2020-21 to 2024-25. We're consulting now on the shape and scope of the programme to inform our views for its future operation. I have to say, though, that decisions on scope of and funding for Uni Connect will need to be taken in the round, taking into account guidance from government and conclusions of future spending reviews. So we don't cover funding levels for 2021, 2022, or for future years in the current consultation. So I would like now to turn to Kirsty Johnson, who is the Programme Manager of the Uni Connect programme, and she's going to provide an introduction to the programme itself and a broad overview of what it is that we're consulting on. So Kirsty, if I can ask you to take the floor, please.
Thanks, Sarah, and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining the event today. My name is Kirsty Johnson. I'm an Access and Participation Manager at the OFS, and I'm also the Uni Connect Programme Manager. So I'm going to just give you a brief overview of what the consultation is and also about the Uni Connect programme, a bit of background for that, and to outline some of our evaluation findings to date as well. Next slide, please. So the Uni Connect programme was initially set up as a 4-year programme and started in January 2017. It was a new programme put in place to achieve the government goals at the time of rapidly increasing the numbers of young people going into higher education from low participation areas. And it also followed on from a previous programme funded by the Higher Education Funding Council for England, or HEFCE, called the National Networks of Collaborative Outreach, which some of you may know about. The programme has 4 key aims. So the first is to reduce the gap in higher education participation between the most and least represented groups, to support young people to make well-informed decisions about their future education, whether that's to go into higher education or not, to support effective and impactful local collaboration between a range of different partners, so higher education providers, including universities and colleges, also working with schools, colleges, employers and other partners like local authorities and local enterprise partnerships. And the final aim is to contribute to a stronger evidence base around what works in higher education outreach and to strengthen evaluation practice in the sector. Next slide, please. So in terms of the approach to the programme to date, Uni Connect supports 29 different partnerships of a range of different partners. So as I mentioned, universities, colleges, local authorities, employers, LEPs, and other local partnerships to provide and deliver activities and information, advice and guidance to support progression into university or college at the sort of higher education level. The first phase began in January 2017 and lasted until July 2019, and it was focused on sustained and progressive programs of targeted outreach and focused on young people in years 9 to 13 living in areas where higher education participation is low, but also lower than might be expected given the GCSE results of that area. The second phase, which we're currently in the second year of, continued support for targeted outreach in phase 1 areas, but also expanded eligibility to older learners studying at level 2 or 3. Second phase also introduced new outreach hubs to signpost teachers and advisors to outreach activities and provided a platform and infrastructure for local collaboration as well. The outreach hub element of the programme currently consists of 3 different elements. So there's a signposting element, proactive support, and strategic engagement. Next slide, please. So the Uni Connect is subject to robust monitoring and evaluation, which consists of different elements. So internal OFS monitoring processes, external program level formative and impact evaluations, which we commission, and local partnership evaluation, including the longitudinal tracking of participants and their outcomes. So from the evaluation to date, we can report that Uni Connect partnerships have delivered impartial, sustained and progressive outreach. They've addressed cold spots in outreach delivery, built strong relationships with schools, colleges and key stakeholders, minimized the engagement burden for schools and colleges by providing that sort of single hub or a point of contact to engage in local outreach, facilitated innovative new approaches and also made progress in engaging with teachers and parents. The evidence of the programme's long-term impact outcomes is not yet available, as no learners have yet received the full 4 to 5 years of sustained and progressive outreach and made their higher education entry decisions. We expect that important evaluation evidence to be generated over the next year or two as those learners who have received sustained and progressive outreach from year 9 make their way through the their educational journeys and make their higher education decisions, and they'll all be tracked in the evaluation through HESA data and also through the different tracking systems. There is, however, a positive correlation between the number of Uni Connect activities learners take part in and improvements in their self-reported knowledge, attitudes and intentions towards educational progress. And evidence from the evaluation has also strongly supported the importance of outreach being delivered in a sustained and progressive way, so rather than one-off interventions. Evidence is also starting to emerge on the effectiveness of delivery, along with evidence at the local level, so of the impact of different interventions on outcomes for learners and at different stages. So this contributes to a greater understanding of what works, in what context and why, and we're hoping that this will continue to develop in time as the programme moves on. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to talk a bit about give an overview of our proposals for the consultation, and then I will hand over to my colleague Jenny Ann Allen, who is the Access and Participation Funding Manager, to take you through some of the detail. So in terms of our ambitions and aims for phase 3, you can see that these have been developed from and built on the current programme aims. So currently we want to continue to contribute to reducing the gap in higher education participation between the most and least represented groups. We want to support a strategic local infrastructure with a range of different partners, reduce burden for schools and colleges to engage in higher education outreach, address outreach cold spots and also offer different routes to progression. And we want to continue to focus on building that stronger evidence base around what works in higher education outreach and strengthen evaluation practice across the sector. What has changed for phase 2 is a bit of a stronger focus on progression from non-traditional routes into and through higher education, including through further education and among mature learners as well. Next slide, please. So for phase 3, there are 3 main elements of the programme that we're proposing. This is signposting, strategic outreach and targeted outreach, all of which currently exist within phase 2 but are configured a little differently. So this is just an overview slide of the different elements that are contained with each of the different parts of phase 3 that we're proposing. And Jenny will go into a bit more detail in the following slides. So now I'll hand over to Jenny, who's our Access and Participation Funding Manager, to take you through the proposals in a bit more detail. Thanks.
Thank you, Kirsty. Yes, I'm going to talk through in a little bit more detail the key elements of our programme proposals that Kirsty's just outlined. So I'll be talking about our proposals for signposting, strategic outreach and targeted outreach, as well as our proposals for funding for the programme from 21-22. Next slide. So within the signposting strand, we will see Uni Connect hubs assisting schools and colleges to find out about and access higher education outreach through acting as a local point of contact and through the provision of web resources. Signposting was introduced in phase 2 of the programme, and we are proposing that this continue into phase 3 with no significant changes planned to this element of the programme. Next slide, thank you. In phase 2, partnerships were encouraged to map outreach activity and engage strategically with partners to understand the landscape of educational disadvantage, high-level skills needs, and joined up careers advice in the area in which they operated, and to develop innovative and locally tailored approaches to address the challenges identified. So in phase 3, we propose in the consultation that this strategic activity will focus in on addressing local outreach gaps to ensure that the most effective use of programme funding and that there is the most effective use of programme funding in support of programme goals. The partnerships will do this through looking at local and national data to understand the extent of gaps in outreach or information, advice and guidance for underrepresented groups in their local area. So for example, they might draw on data from their tracking partner, look at the national data published by the OFS, or draw on locally generated information. They will then engage strategically with local partners to address these outreach gaps and work collaboratively to help develop new or expanded outreach provision to address these priorities, drawing on in additional funding to support this where local resources allow. Next slide, thank you. So when we talk about underrepresented groups in this context, we mean groups of potential or current students where the OFS can identify gaps in equality of opportunity in different parts of the student life cycle. These groups are set out in our Access and Participation Plan Regulation guidance, and I've listed them here for reference. The kinds of groups that partnerships might opt to support through their strategic outreach includes learners with particular characteristics that, based on their small size, may be more appropriately tackled across the whole partnership area rather than at school or college level. So for example, this could include care leavers, people from Gypsy, Roma and traveller communities, or refugees. Next slide, thank you. So moving now to our targeted outreach, we're proposing to move away from a focus on target areas and instead focus on target schools and colleges. We believe that this will provide economies of scale and will be more efficient while still directing funding where it is most needed. We envisage that 2021-22 will be a transitional year in which partnerships will use the current area-based model and their local knowledge to identify their target schools and colleges. From 2022-23, the OFS will identify the schools and colleges that we want partnerships to engage for targeted outreach. Programme funding, or at least an element of it, will be driven by this new targeting methodology. We intend to consult further on this methodology and how this might relate to programme funding later in 2021. We envisage that the new approach may mirror the approach that was used by HEFCE to identify the original programme target wards. For example, so that means that we will look at where higher education participation is low and where it is low, taking into account key stage 4 attainment. And on my next slide, I'll say a little bit more about this. Can we move on, please? So this slide will give you a quick reminder of how we identified the target areas used in phase 1 and 2 of the programme. Partnerships currently focus on the geographic areas in England where evidence suggests there's the greatest potential for impact. And this was identified by HEFGE at the time by looking at the areas where higher education participation is lowest. So those are the places marked in red on the left-hand side of the map, or the left-hand map. It also used a gap analysis to identify the areas where participation is lower than might be expected given GCSE attainment. These are marked in red and orange on the middle map. The programme then targets the areas where these two approaches coincide, and those give us the green areas in the right-hand side of the map, which are the current areas targeted by the Uni Connect programme. This can be a bit counterintuitive, as we're not necessarily targeting the areas with the worst participation. We're focusing on areas where there is a gap in participation and where young people have the potential to reach higher education. We're exploring taking a similar approach within the new methodology, though not necessarily using polar or gaps, but that is not yet determined, and the detail is not the focus of this current consultation. We are intending to consult further on our approach to identifying priority schools and colleges in a further consultation in 2021. But we do welcome any comments that respondents might have on this in their responses to this current consultation. Next slide, please. So once the target schools and colleges have been identified, we will provide guidance to support partnerships to prioritise their engagement with underrepresented learners in priority schools and colleges. We anticipate that partnerships will work with learners from year 9 upwards. Partnerships will work with the schools and colleges identified to understand the information, advice and guidance and outreach needs of these learners, and identify what outreach provision might already be in place and what gaps might remain. And through such an approach, the programme will target its resources towards learners in the schools and colleges where they can have the greatest impact, taking into account the wider landscape of provider and third-party outreach. The programme evaluation has demonstrated the value of situating outreach interventions within a sustained and progressive framework, and we would expect the use of progression frameworks to continue in phase 3. We recognise that more interventions may be needed to raise the participation rates of mature learners, and that Uni Connect could play a stronger role here through supporting collaboration so that adults seeking higher education can find out about and access different types of courses. We therefore want to see a greater focus on further education colleges in the programme and more activity with mature learners. Next slide, please. So we do recognise that by moving to an approach that is focused on particular schools and colleges, we risk a loss of engagement with some of the learners who've already been involved in sustained and progressive programmes of Uni Connect activity. Prematurely withdrawing outreach from learners who are partway through their time in school or college might be detrimental to the outcomes we want to achieve. We therefore want to facilitate access to higher education outreach for learners who've already begun their Uni Connect journey through phases 1 and 2 of the programme, and who would benefit from ongoing outreach and support. Doing this is intended to protect our past investment, support ongoing evaluation, and limit any negative impact on learners from changes to programme targeting. We expect partnerships to consider what outreach may be available through other sources, such as provider outreach, when determining what support to offer to these learners. We expect partnerships to prioritise learners who might not receive higher education outreach appropriate to their needs without programme intervention. Next slide. So this slide here will illustrate the cohorts who will have commenced engagement with the programme in phases 1 or 2 and would continue their engagement with the programme through the support I've just outlined. So you can see them and the different phases that they would be in and where we are now, and then what we would see happening through phase 3. My next slide, I'll now come on to talk about the funding. So funding levels for Uni Connect for 2021-22 are subject to decision making by the OFS, having regard to the level of teaching grant funding in each year, any statutory guidance, our general duties and our public sector equality duty. The consultation does not seek views on what level of funding should be provided for the programme. However, we do set out a proposed approach to distributing programme funding during 2021-22, which uses a slightly modified iteration of the current funding model. We've included a minimum allocation within the Outreach Hubs element of the funding model to provide a degree of protection for smaller partnerships in the event of any budget reductions. My next slide will illustrate how we've developed our proposals to be scalable, enabling us to adapt our expectations to the level of funding available. This diagram, which is in the consultation document, seeks to reflect this. We will adapt our expectations around engagement with target schools and colleges, engagement with learners who've already been involved in the programme, and around strategic activity in line with the available funding. Next slide, please. So with respect to next steps, the consultation closes on the 19th of January, and we really invite all of those on this call or anyone else with an interest in the programme to respond. We will analyse the responses, which will inform our decisions around the future of the programme. We intend to publish a summary of responses to the consultation in spring 2021 on the OFS website, alongside our decisions around the future of the programme. We anticipate conducting a second consultation during 2021 to explore more details about our approach to funding and targeting from 2022-23 onwards. That's all from me now. I'll hand back over to Sarah.
Okay. Well, thank you both to Jenny and Kirsty for that. We are actually now running ahead of schedule, so we do have plenty of time for questions should you wish to ask them. We haven't had that many come through in the Q&A, so if you could just post your questions in the Q&A, and I'd just like to remind you not to use the chat function. That is only that chat function is only to talk to the OFS staff, not to ask questions around the presentations themselves. So as you can see, we have Kirsty and Jenny and myself, if needed, here to answer questions. So if they can turn their cameras back on, that would be brilliant. Thank you. So we've had some come through. So we've had colleagues in the background doing a great job here of pulling some of these together. So if you just bear with me a second, so I can just get the document at the right place. Okay, so we have a question here from Rosie, who's asked, can you please explain hub and partnership? Are they the same thing or different entities? If the latter, what is the proposed role of each and how will they relate to each other? Jenny or Kirsty, would you like to answer that one?
Yeah, I'm very happy to pick that one up. So I think to some extent they are to a degree a little interchangeable. In phase 2, we have had an element of the work that we've referred to as outreach hubs. So that refers to the work that partnerships currently do around their kind of signposting and strategic outreach work. I think going forward into phase 3, we think it's perhaps not a hugely helpful distinction to talk about kind of hubs and partnerships as two kind of separate things. What we are funding is a partnership of different organisations and stakeholders that come together to form a Uni Connect hub, and that hub will deliver both strategic outreach and targeted outreach. So apologies if it's a little this kind of phase moving between one kind of way of talking about it and another is a little confusing, but yes, they to the extent that they're sort of described in terms of our phase 3 approach, they are a little interchangeable.
Thanks, Jenny. We've had another question in from somebody who didn't want to give their name. So how did you ensure engagement by HEI partners in respect of their access and participation plans in working with the Uni Connect programme to focus outreach activities in covering the needs of the local area? I think I should probably take that one, given it's spanning both the provider regulation through access and participation plans and Uni Connect. Our approach in the access and participation plans was very much to get providers, HE providers, universities and colleges, to really focus on the areas where they have the biggest gaps in outcomes for their students. For some, that would be certainly in access, but for others, it might be in non-continuation of existing students, the outcomes in terms of degree attainment for existing students, or progression into employment. So it's very much where the key gaps were for those providers. That's where they had to concentrate their activity within their APPs. We did encourage providers in writing and pulling together their access and participation plans to think about collaborative activity, and also to think about setting collaborative targets where that would be appropriate. But it wasn't for us to dictate or prescribe what should be in an individual provider's access and participation plan. But clearly we were very happy to see where they did mention that they were working as part of a Uni Connect partnership. Okay, so this is one from Phil Dent. Re the scalable approach. Sorry, this keeps moving around because people are actually uploading stuff to it as we speak. Re the scalable approach to funding. Is the intention to scale the investment at each level described, or to fund or not fund individual levels entirely accordingly? Jenny, did you want to?
Yeah, happy to pick that up. So, so I think it's talking about how what we will do once the OFS is clear what funding is available for the program. We will then be able to think about the different aspects that are outlined in that diagram, and think about what's the appropriate level of activity we would expect here. So it's not to say that we would necessarily be kind of doing everything proportionately or apply the same levels of increases or decreases in activity. It could be that we would move to having, you know, we might ultimately want to have the bulk of the funding going into targeted outreach, and we would protect that, and then look to have slightly less going into the strategic outreach side if we had to make that change. I think so there's no intention in terms of what we've set out that we would be having things that we've got a kind of clear decision already around what we would prioritize and how things would work. But I think what we've described in there is something whereby the extent to which we might expect partnerships to be doing strategic outreach, or the extent of engagement with those learners that have already been involved with the programme, or the extent of activity with target schools and colleges, can all be flexed and is scalable depending on that funding. And we will obviously think through what our expectations might be of partnerships, and there will be a degree of to which they will want to bring in their own local knowledge and sort of thinking around that as well.
Okay, thanks, Jenny. So just sticking with some of the funding questions that are coming through. So Suzanne Marchant has asked, how will the current hubs and targeted outreach funding formula be adjusted for phase 3? Phase 3 looks like the focus is on hubs and targeted outreach delivered through hubs. Is there any indication of the relative funding? So Jenny, that's one for you again.
Yeah, so we've set out in the consultation the detail of how we would anticipate it working for the first year of phase 3. So that's 21-22. So we've earmarked there a kind of an assumed level of funding of £10 million which is using the existing hubs funding methodology. So we would envisage that would be available there for the infrastructure to support the signposting and the strategic outreach, and then the remainder will be for the targeted outreach. But as I said, we don't yet know what the funding level will be for the programme, and both elements are scalable. So we're seeking feedback on that. Beyond that, we don't we don't have a methodology yet for identifying those target schools and colleges, and we'll be looking to consult on that later in 2021. So I'm not really in a position to say what things might look like for 22-23 onwards, other than that we are looking at delivering targeted outreach, strategic outreach and signposting, and we'll be looking to develop a funding methodology that would support those areas.
Thanks, Jenny. A quick question here from Sarah Roche. With the timeline for the consultations, is there likely to be a break in delivery around the 31st of July 2021?
That's certainly not our intention. We recognise that there are people working extremely hard to deliver the programme, and when we want to support the smooth kind of ongoing delivery of activity. So our ambition is to have established our funding for the future and worked with the partnership leads to kind of agree their plans for the future, so that they're ready to start delivery from the 1st of August.
Okay, thanks, Jenny. Okay, there's some questions here sort of focusing on targeting methodology, how schools and colleges and so on will be identified. So we'll do a few of those now. So Hannah Mary has asked, I appreciate this will form part of a later consultation, so there may not be an answer, but I wonder if the OFS might consider aligning student targeting within the high priority schools, colleges with schools-based metrics of disadvantage, such as pupil premium or free school meals. This would be easy for schools to understand and would hopefully reduce burden on having to target on university access measures they may not be familiar with or use often. Jenny, I will ask you to respond to this. I would say more broadly in terms of the data that we use around access and participation, that we do appreciate some of the limitations of the data that is used across actually education, and we do understand the desirability to join things up in that respect, and we have published the association between characteristics of students data set, which does bring in a greater range of student characteristics. So it is a more sophisticated measure, but obviously we are a little bit constrained on what we can do in the more immediate term. But Jenny, did you want to come in on this point particularly? Oh, I think we might have lost Jenny. I think we have. Okay. So yeah, I think we've actually lost Jenny for the time being. Oh no, she's back. She's just come back. That's okay.
Apologies, everyone. I had a brief internet outage, but I'm back. But I did miss part of the question. Apologies. So
okay, that's it. That's fine. I'll read it out again. So the question is, I wonder if the OFS might consider aligning student targeting within the high priority schools and colleges with school-based metrics of disadvantage, such as pupil premium or free school meals. This would be easy for schools to understand and would hopefully reduce burden on having to target on university access measures they may not be familiar with or use often.
Thank you. I think that's a helpful question. It's useful, I think, to perhaps distinguish between how we will identify the target schools and colleges and how the partnerships might then identify who they are going to work with within those target schools and colleges. So we don't yet know what our methodology will be for identifying the target schools and colleges, but I've outlined the sort of one way we want to explore, which is looking at higher education participation and how that relates contextually to GCSEs. So that would be a way of identifying the priority school or college. But then in terms of how the partnership might want to then work with the school to identify those young people that it might want to target. We've talked in our consultation about underrepresented groups, and thinking about things like free school meals would be one way for the partnership could then explore that. So we will be working up more guidance for partnerships on that, and we do welcome views from we do welcome views from respondents around that, and this is something. This kind of suggestion is something I think that we'd welcome and we will explore further. But yeah, I think that's a useful distinction between the two.
Thanks, Jenny. I think the next question I think is broadly in the same ballpark as this, which is, could you characterise the data sets that may be used for the new targeting methodology in a rough timeline for when Uni Connect partnerships and also higher education providers may learn more about this? I ask as an outreach manager wanting to ensure we can plan our school partnerships well. So I think that's going in the sort of same direction as the answer you just gave, Jenny, which is this is something that we are we're actively considering now, and that we are actively seeking, we'll be seeking further views on. Did you want to add anything more to that?
I mean, in terms of our timelines, and obviously anything involving timelines is tricky at the moment, but we are working towards a being able to come out on this later in 2021, and certainly at the moment we're thinking kind of mid 2021. So we want to make sure that there's plenty of time for both to gather engagement from partnerships, schools, colleges and others in that consultation, but also then once it's clear who partnerships will be working with, lots of time for them to be building up their relationships. And I think that would also create time for other providers to be thinking about what that might mean for their outreach plans and their prioritization. So our aspiration is that you will know in 2021 who's being targeted from 2022, 23 onwards. But clearly, you know, anything involving timelines at the moment is difficult, but that's our aspiration.
Excellent, thank you. So a question here from Joanna Tolley. What year is the Key Stage 4 data captured? How long ago? Is it fair that eligibility depends on the GCSE results of young people in previous years? Does this method of targeting risk missing people who live in areas where Key Stage 4 attainment is low, thus increasing inequalities? I think that's another one for you, Jenny.
Yeah, I mean, I think with any targeting methodology, there is a risk of missing certain individuals, and you know, I think there will always be groups within any sort of wider area or wider school or wider sort of target population that have needs that might not be recognised because of the method of targeting. I mean, I think in part by equipping the partnerships with sort of funding for the targeted outreach, but also funding for strategic outreach, that does enable them to work with their local partners to explore whether there are gaps that are left by the targeted outreach that aren't being addressed through either provider activity, third-party outreach or other means, and to enable them to think about how they might want to tackle that. So I know that doesn't necessarily find those those individuals that could benefit who might be within a wider population that isn't being targeted, but it does, hopefully between the two approaches, you've got a greater flexibility for addressing needs as best we can within the resources that are there.
Okay, thanks, Jenny. Let me just see. So can you say to what extent it's envisaged partnerships will have scope to use local data intelligence to influence school college targeting, please?
Yeah, so I think in terms of the schools and colleges that will be targeted through the targeted outreach element, that will be done nationally through the OFS and through the work that we do. So we will be doing that at a national level in the same way as we used a national approach to identify the target wards, target areas that are currently being addressed through the programme. However, as I said, through the strategic outreach, that's very much where we would expect the partnerships to be using their local intelligence, and also in conversations with the target schools and colleges to identify which learners would best benefit from those programme interventions. So we think that there's a huge role for local intelligence, but it won't be involved in informing our decisions around targeting of targeted outreach.
Okay, thank you, Jenny. So let me just have a look at this one. I'm sorry, I just saw one that I wanted to ask. I did see one. I just wanted to ask it. It's just this document keeps moving on me. I do apologise for this a second. Okay, so another question here from Rosie. One of the key challenges in the current programme is encouraging local schools to participate and access support for their students. Will the new programme include any kind of duty on schools to participate? Have you discussed this with the DFE? Just before I ask if Kirsty or Jenny want to respond to this, we are constantly in contact with DFE, particularly obviously DFE colleagues that are looking that work in the HE sphere, and we do have contact with DFE colleagues in the schools section as well. Placing a duty on schools to participate, I imagine, is going to be quite a difficult one. So I don't think that we would expect anything quite like that. But I can assure you that we are in constant discussion with DFE. We have understood the challenges that the programme and predecessor programmes has had in engaging some schools in the activity. So we do understand that it's not always easy to engage schools, and we are continuing that dialogue with DFE in that respect. I don't know, Kirsty or Jenny, whether you want to say any more on that one.
Yeah, I think you've covered most of the main points. I don't think we would be able to place a duty on schools to engage, but I think the fact that the partnerships have been sort of working for 4 years to build up really strong relationships with schools and colleges is a really important part of the infrastructure of what we want to maintain going into phase 3, so that those strong relationships that have already been built can be sort of developed upon. And there are opportunities for us to speak to DFE. As Sarah said, we do speak to them on a regular basis to see if there is any kind of guidance we can provide, but I don't think we would be able to sort of put a duty on schools.
Thanks, Kirsty. So a question here from Ginny. So this is sort of talking about the role of FE. To what extent has and will the Uni Connect programme increase participation in higher education and further education colleges as well as in universities? FEC provision is typically in higher technical education, for which awareness is low, but the benefits can be high. FECs also tend to recruit well from disadvantaged groups and adults for their HE courses. Kirsty, did you want to come in on that one?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the question, Ginny. Yeah, this is a really key element of phase 3 that we're proposing in the consultation. So at the moment, Uni Connect programme does encourage sort of students to progress into higher education in both further education colleges and universities, providing them with the impartial information, advice and guidance to make the right choice for them. But in phase 3, we're proposing much a stronger focus on engagement with mature learners and those studying at level 3 and those studying at college, so that those students can look at alternative routes into higher education as well. So it doesn't necessarily mean that it would be doing a 3-year degree, but can be sort of higher level qualifications that may lead to a degree in future or may not. There may be technical routes like degree apprenticeships or higher level apprenticeships as well. So we are really keen for the programme in phase 3 to explore supporting those sort of non-traditional, more technical routes into higher education study, and for mature learners to be included in that as well.
Thanks, Kirsty. I think we can't sort of underestimate the importance of local partnerships and making sure that the programme is able to work across different educational sectors, different educational partners, and that, as we said in the introduction, that we recognise the importance of different and various routes through further and higher education, and that won't necessarily be that through that linear straight from school into degree level provision. So it's an incredibly important part of the programme going into the future. A question from Jodie Meakin. Secondly, if there is a movement towards targeted colleges, do you have an idea at this time how many schools and colleges will be moving into phase 3 of the Uni Connect programme in comparison to how many are part of it now? I'm not sure that one has been answered. I don't know whether we would be able to say at this point, but Kirsty or Jenny, if you can.
So at the moment, we're envisaging that 2021-22 will be a bit of a transition year. So we will be planning to do a consultation on the targeting methodology for priority schools and colleges for 2022 onwards. So for 21-22, we imagine that all the partnerships will continue working with the same schools and colleges that they currently work with in the next academic year. And then following that, we will be doing the consultation on the methodology to kind of identify those colleges. So we wouldn't be able to say at this point what the difference is between those who are currently engaged now and those engaged in the future. I think colleges are in a really unique position because they both provide learners who engage in Uni Connect activities, but they also provide higher education as well. So they kind of can both be partners and recipients of Uni Connect activity, which is an interesting position and is something we want to continue supporting.
Okay, thanks, Kirsty. Question here, which is anonymous actually. What are the benefits you foresee of a school-based over a place-based approach? As we already use data on which target wards are within the catchment areas of the schools, colleges we work with to inform our targeting and priorities, so it doesn't seem too different. Also, with the push towards mature learners, place-based approaches have benefit. For example, working with mature learners in community contexts. Jenny, do you want to take that one?
Yes, so the reason we are looking at moving away from an area-based approach is that certainly at the moment we observe that partnerships need to work with a range of quite a different varied number of schools and colleges in order to access the same number of programme target learners, depending on how those learners might be distributed across in terms of where they live and where they study. And that can dilute the programme offer to some schools and colleges in some areas, meaning that some partnerships can work in much more concentrated way with particular schools and colleges and give them a really high level of engagement, whereas others, purely because of the distribution of their target learners, are having to work in a much more kind of spread out way. And it can also result in a much higher proportion of non-target learners receiving programme activities, where you've only got a relatively small proportion of target learners within any one school or college. So moving from an area-based approach to focus on schools and colleges will give us economies of scale and will be more efficient while still directing the funding where it's most needed. And I think we do recognise the point you've made about mature learners, and I think you could make the same point about some other groups, particularly those that might have kind of a relatively small number in any one particular school or population. So care leavers is one example. So that's one of the reasons why we're also focusing on the strategic outreach element. So what you effectively would have is a sort of school and college based targeting for that targeted outreach, but then you've got the strategic outreach, which is area based. It's focusing on the whole area covered by the partnership, but in a way that enables them to then take strategic decisions about where to focus their resources. So we're hoping that we're kind of capturing the best of both, if that makes sense. But I do take on board the points that have been raised.
Thanks, Jenny. So a question here from Danielle Mannion. The new proposal suggests working with year 9 and onwards again. What was behind this decision? Much research suggests outreach is more successful when it begins earlier. Additionally, many partnerships responding to school requests already work with year 8 students due to options taken in this year. Jenny or Kirsty, who I don't mind.
I'm happy to pick this one up. So, I mean, I think we do take on board that the earlier engagement is very beneficial. I think there's also, though, the kind of counter argument around obviously within the programme we only have so many resources that we need to think about how we're going to use and how we're going to focus, and we're very keen to be obviously kind of looking at the outcomes that come from this and kind of tracking young people through. So I guess the earlier that we go, working with year 8s, year 7s, or even below, we're potentially kind of needing therefore to take the same amount of funding, but then spread that amongst kind of a smaller group of young people, but working with them perhaps for longer, or perhaps working at a younger age but not at an older age. I think it is quite challenging for us to be thinking about younger age groups, but I don't think we disagree that working with younger people can be beneficial. But I think for us it was about making the best use of the resources that the programme can bring.
I think that's right, and just to add to that, I think when we were originally looking at a national collaborative outreach programme some time ago, the feedback that we were getting is that certainly universities and colleges are much happier collaborating and delivering collaborative activity to younger age groups. Once you get beyond that and you're actually looking at potential recruitment, that's when the competition between providers can actually play a part as well. So there was a sense in which the national programme could address that issue of collaboration versus competition in a way that perhaps collaborations that would occur without the OFS support may not happen. So it was felt that actually making sure that you continue to be able to deliver impartial information, advice, guidance activity to young people right through their school career was going to be really important. So year 9 onwards, where issues of competition may well start to kick in, we're also part of the original rationale for concentrating on those year groups. But as Jenny says, we absolutely agree that working across actually the educational life course is really important. Okay, so Ant Sutcliffe has a slight concern. Is adding mature learners to the target cohort list, more emphasis on FECs, and slowly phasing out engagement with Uni Connect learners who've started their journey with an expected funding cut may see us being jack of all trades and masters of none, following years of evidence suggesting that 7 or 8 interactions on a sustained programme is the only way we know we move our young people to HE. Question is, are we confident that funds will flow that see us keep having meaningful impact, or will things go a bit NNCO? Again, think all proposals are very, very sensible though. Thanks. So I think a question here, Jenny, which is we are potentially asking partnerships to do more with less. And so are we confident that actually they will be able to still deliver a comprehensive and progressive programme of activity?
I mean, I think, you know, we are in regular engagement with partnership leads, with chairs through the consultation. We welcome feedback on this point. I think it is a difficult challenge. You know, we know that there's a lot of different things where a program such as Uni Connect could add value, and we've tried to find a balance between both between kind of prescription and flexibility, and also around making sure that we're covering a range of groups where we know that the program could add value. So I think it's a fair challenge to us. I think, you know, we will have to work and work with the with those involved in leading the program locally to do our best to kind of chart that course. But I think, you know, we do feel that having a combination of that strategic outreach where there is that flexibility for partnerships to work locally to kind of determine priorities and address gaps, and then the prescription that would come from the targeted outreach is an appropriate balance. But again, we welcome thoughts from respondents on this question.
Thanks, Jenny. So a question here from Ashley. What happens to target students in schools that were previously engaging with the Uni Connect partnership in phases 1 and 2, but are not recognised as priority schools in phase 3?
I'm happy to pick this up. So I did touch on this in the presentation, in that we are earmarking funding to support ongoing engagement with those learners, and we see you know, we think it would be hugely difficult if we were to sort of step away from providing them with ongoing support. We know that ongoing progression and ongoing engagement is really vital. So we are looking to put aside some funding to help partnerships to support them. I think, you know, we will be looking to partnerships to think about how best they can use that resource and be looking at what is already available in an area. So if you've got young people who have been working with the programme, whose school or college is no longer going to be a priority within the programme, and it's clear that they're going to be getting getting quite a bit of engagement through either the partnership members, through the outreach that they already do, or through other means, then that would perhaps be less of a priority. If there's going to be a gap for those learners and they're not going to get their needs met, then that's where we'd hope that our funding can come in and the partnerships can continue to provide them with an element of support and engagement going forward.
Okay, thanks, Jenny. Just to say, colleagues, I think we may have lost Kirsty for the time being. I think she may be having connection issues. So all of this is kind of falling on to Jenny at the moment. So I will help you out here, Jenny, until we get Kirsty back. So we've got two questions here that actually I think are sort of talking about the same issue. So first of all, regarding your adult outreach, will this focus on learners already enrolled on a suitable level 3 programme up to HE, or is there more of a scope to encourage learners to engage at level 3 if they don't already? And that's links to another question, which is that adult learners at level 3 generally receive good HE engagement. Therefore, would it not be best to focus on learners at other points of the journey? So I think this has come up quite recently, Jenny. So do you want to take that one?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So I think in terms of framing our expectations around mature learners, we are mindful of the challenges around kind of working with this group and the potential huge scope for activity that the program could do in this area. I mean, I think you could potentially have a program of similar scale to Uni Connect and just focus on mature learners and still only kind of start to scratch the surface of the issue. So I think we want to be targeted in this, in that and make sure that the program is engaging with those learners who are kind of part way on their journey to higher education, I guess, and would benefit perhaps from impartial information, advice and guidance and engagement to support them in making important decisions about their future careers, rather, I guess, than kind of look at engaging with people that perhaps might be a few steps back, which is incredibly important, but actually, the potential demands on the program of doing that could be unmanageable. So in an effort to be more focused and targeted with the expectations that we might place on partnerships, we identified that level 3 might be an appropriate way for us to sort of focus that engagement and for us to place our expectations. We have had engagement already with around the question of why level 3, why not level 2, and we're really welcome to kind of hearing that and reflecting on that. I think it was the greater distance that level 2 learners have to travel in order to progress into higher education sort of indicated that perhaps that wouldn't necessarily be best addressed through a program like Uni Connect, but we are really welcome and up for hearing kind of feedback if that's felt not to be the case.
Thanks, Jenny. So staying with the focus on mature learners for a moment, another question here, which is, given that outreach hubs will be comprised of a mixture of FE and HE providers, all of whom will have different objectives and agendas, what measures will you be putting in place to ensure that work and activity delivered for this target group will remain impartial and objective rather than an extension to an individual institution's recruitment department? If I can just sort of start off on this one, I think this speaks very much to the relationships within the individual partnerships, and this is not necessarily a new issue either in terms of the Uni Connect partnerships. So I would say that we will obviously be monitoring what's happening across the life of the programme. But what we would want to see is a progression framework as there is now that would encompass mature learners as it does for young learners. We don't see that they should necessarily be treated any differently in that sense in terms of the engagements that they receive and the level of impartial advice and guidance that they get. But as I say, I think this is very much will be very dependent upon the nature of the relationships between the different delivery partners within each individual partnership to ensure that actually is the case. Jenny, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I think you've picked up on that. Thanks.
Thank you. Right, let me just so could you please talk a little bit more about what you mean when you say mature learners? and I think that we're talking about learners that are beyond school age. They've already left school. They are, sort of 19 plus. I mean, the sort of official and mature student category would be 21 years and above, but actually when we're talking about entry into HE, I think we're talking about slightly younger upwards. Jenny, did you want to clarify?
Yeah, so when the programme was initially established, it was and phase one was purely a young participation focused programme. So we were working with young people who were up to year 13. So I think it was up to 19. And in phase two, we did expand that slightly to enable partnerships to work with those with learners above that if they were resident in those wards and studying alongside those younger learners. So I think, in a way we're within the phase three proposals, we are sort of following that vein. So I think we're just thinking about people that are older than 19.
Thanks, Jenny. There's a question here: how will hubs reach mature learners? Is it just through FE colleges, or could the hubs work in other ways?
So I think on this, I mean, we see the mature learners work is in part it could be picked up through the targeted outreach work. So if a partnership is working with a particular college, then we'd be expecting them to think about their work with both young and mature learners and how they can tackle that. But also I think through the strategic outreach activity, which does have much more scope for being flexible and actually does enable you to look at look across a sort of wider vista and think about those needs. That's not to say that every partnership would necessarily be expected to do strategic work with mature learners, but we think that across both of them, it gives quite a bit of flexibility around how best to take this forward. And we do, I think, in all of this with Uni Connect, we've always recognised that local context is key, and we want the partnerships to think about what's already happening, to be thinking about the kind of needs of the learners that they're engaging with, and working with partners, employers, others to think this through.
Thanks, Jenny. So it's quite a long question here, which is related around COVID and the impact of the pandemic. So this will take a little while to to read out. Is there any thinking on using the Uni Connect infrastructure to help schools, colleges, and students recover from COVID? The pandemic, the impacts of the pandemic. COVID-19 has detrimentally affected 2 academic years worth of education for young people. There's a lack of acknowledgement of this in the consultation. Given the ever-changing landscape the pandemic has had on education provision, there is a unique opportunity to mitigate against the negative effects on schools, colleges, teachers and students, and combat the educational deficit faced by large portions of these audiences by using the existing national infrastructure, staff, resources, contacts and experience of Uni Connect. A rapid and effective countermeasure could be put in place to target and help students, teachers, schools and colleges educationally recover from this unprecedented crisis. Shall I kick that one off, Jenny? So I think this is something that we have clearly thought about, and as the pandemic hit, obviously we sent out guidance to the Uni Connect partnerships, and they very rapidly pivoted their activity in order to continue to deliver their outreach activity digitally, remotely, to the young people that they were working with. This is asking a much more fundamental question. This is asking whether the Uni Connect partnerships themselves can mitigate some of the impact of the pandemic on learning outcomes. And that's a much bigger ask, a much bigger question. The Uni Connect program is an outreach program. It delivers activities that are fundamentally around outreach, not around attainment raising. And that would fundamentally change the nature of the program. It would have a huge impact on the staffing of the program and the kind of skills and competencies that would be needed in order to deliver that in schools. So that would be an enormous change. I think, to the scale and scope of this programme, and it is not really within the remit for us to do that at this stage. I think what Uni Connect can do is continue to work with schools and colleges in their local areas. They are also able to act as a conduit. And so, you know, they are made up of partner institutions, of higher education institutions and colleges who may be able to support schools in this regard. But they are, and they never were, designed to deliver that kind of intensive attainment raising activities. And I think we just simply don't have the scope to make that kind of fundamental change to the programme. I think this is something that has to complement that activity and be there very clearly in terms of understanding what the routes are, making sure that that's clearly laid out for young people so that they know what their options are when they reach those ages of 16 and then subsequently 18. Jenny, did you want to say? I mean, I would say that, you know, partnerships do some of that kind of activity, but it is not the bulk of what they deliver. Jenny, sorry.
Yeah, no, I would agree with you, Sarah, and I think responding to that kind of need isn't something that we've built into our plans for the future. I guess partly because we're looking at you know, at the next academic year and beyond, and also as you've outlined, I think, you know, the scale of potential need for activity around that would be far bigger than what the programme is kind of here for and designed to do.
Thanks, Jenny. Okay, so we've got a message. I've got a question here. Higher education typically prospers in periods of recession and recovery. A, how will we be able to disaggregate the effect of the post-COVID recession and recovery on participation from the effect of Uni Connect? And B, what analysis can we do on behaviour during previous recessions to help us learn the lessons of history? A really interesting question, and I think that is going to be a very key question for our evaluation of the programme as it goes forward, understanding or trying to isolate the impact of particular activities over other external factors is always a real challenge for any kind of evaluation of the effectiveness of a programme. We have, though, had 4 years of the programme already in which the evaluation infrastructure of the programme has been built up very, very strongly. The partnerships themselves have developed their own evaluation capacity enormously over this period. We have the great work that the trackers do. So that should give us, I think, enough scope to be able to make to draw some conclusions, if not be able to sort of actually point to a causal impact, causal effect, which of course is very, very difficult to do in normal times anyway. Jenny, did you want to come in on that one?
No, I'm good, thanks. So just to flag, I think Kirsty is back with us now as well, so may want to contribute.
Oh, great, that's brilliant. Good to have you back, Kirsty.
Sorry about that, everyone.
No, that's fine. In terms of what analysis can we do on behaviour during previous recessions to help us learn the lessons of history? I mean, we do a lot of work, generally speaking. I say we, I'm sort of taking credit for the work of our amazing analysts here, who have, when we come across this before, have been able to see how higher education participation does change during that period. You tend to get, for example, many more mature students, but we have to remember that the last real big economic shock happened before the changes to fees that came in 2012, and so it'd be interesting as well to see how that might be a factor in what happens next. But absolutely take the point that there is a sense of sheltering within higher education to weather the storm of economic shocks, so we will certainly be paying close attention to that. Okay, yeah, so I think, again, there's quite a few here about how we're taking into account the impact of COVID on schools and colleges. And I think certainly, and Kirsty, I don't know whether you want to talk about some of the feedback we've had from partnerships around the what they've seen the impact to be of COVID on schools and colleges and their engagement with the programme.
Yeah, I think it's been a mixed picture for different partnerships. I think those that have staff based in schools and colleges have been able to maintain really good engagement throughout, but obviously it has been really difficult. And the first lockdown was a bit of a really challenging time because everyone was just trying to find their way through how to deal with it and how to do online learning and things. But I think the partnerships really quickly pivoted their activities to provide online outreach really well, actually. And we've seen from monitoring that there's still been a really high number of activities that have happened online, a number of young people that have engaged with the programme over the past year, so which takes into account the first lockdown of COVID. So there's been some really positive things going on, particularly nationally as well. So obviously with the digital outreach, there's a much broader reach as well. So partnerships have been able to kind of expand their reach to other learners they might not have been able to engage with before, because those students may not have been traditionally sort of the target Uni Connect learners. And I think obviously as schools returned, partnerships were able to kind of get back in contact with some of the schools that they might not have had relationships with during the height of lockdown. But now again, we're kind of back into a lockdown, but it does seem that everyone's a bit more prepared for it this time, having gone through it once before. So I think there's a range of activities I've seen on our community platform that people are sharing amongst each other of all the different festivals. Engagement with parents has really blossomed actually in this period, has been much more well taken up actually by parents by doing it online. So that's been a really positive aspect actually that's come out of this as well.
Great, thank you, Kirsty. So a question here, after this COVID year, HEIs are working more nationally than limited to local. Is this proposal out of sync? How will national coverage be ensured? Can I just say on that one, this is a national programme that operates at the local level, and so we do cover England in terms of the Uni Connect coverage. And also, this is about impartial information, advice, guidance and activity to learners. It isn't about recruitment to individual higher education providers. And so the fact that individual providers do work nationally and always have done, that is not the purpose of the Uni Connect programme. The Uni Connect programme is there to serve those local areas and those communities and ensure that they have all of the information they need to make informed choices about the next step in their educational careers. So it is national, operating at the local level, and is about serving those communities rather than actually the recruitment needs of individual providers. Jenny, Kirsty, did you want to say anything more on that?
I think just to say that there are also other sort of national programs that a number of the partnerships also engage with.
Yeah.
So there is that national focus as well. And on a national level, the partnerships do kind of get in touch with each other and have regular meetings and contact about how we can share things across the piece as well. So it's not just focused on the local.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so just thinking a little bit about delivery, will the scoping of outreach activities undertaken by the hubs and the signposting role include the existing work of third sector providers in regions and in schools? Kirsty, did you want to take that one?
Yeah, sure. I think this is something that we appreciate, that there's a number of third sector providers that provide outreach, and we have pulled together sort of a useful information resource on our website highlighting all of those that do provide digital outreach as well, especially during COVID. In phase 3, we will take a similar approach so that it's up to individual partnerships to decide who they would like to engage with in terms of third sector provision. And it's not for the OFS to really kind of dictate or be prescriptive about that, but it really depends on the partnerships deciding amongst themselves what would be the best method and mode of delivery for the learners that they have in their cohorts.
Thanks, Kirsty. Okay, so a question here. Some schools have felt that due to their location, they've completely missed out on funding, especially if they're in an in-between area of slight but not definite overlap. Will the new proposals make areas more definitive? So I think what we may be talking here is where you have partnerships working in different areas, and actually a school is falling in an area that where there's some confusion or doesn't seem to be engaged with by any of the partnerships around it. So Jenny, did you want to tackle that one?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, and I think in a way that's a bit of an illustration of some of the challenges with the current area-based model, in that you may well have you're targeting learners from a particular geographic area, but they may well go to a range of different schools. So partnerships are working with schools to an extent, but they may not be a priority. And I think what the new model will provide is at least more clarity, as was outlined in there, where there will be schools that will definitively be target schools or not. That doesn't mean that those schools that are not target would not be able to access some support and engagement through their local partnership, because we have the signposting element. There may also be work with schools taking place through strategic outreach, but I think at least for those, it should result in perhaps a bit more clarity around kind of which schools are in receipt of targeted outreach and which are not. And for those that are, there should be the scale to ensure that there's a relatively high level of engagement possible with those schools. So I think we will be giving clarity, if not necessarily reaching all of the schools that may potentially be able to benefit from the programme, because I think, you know, within any programme, we will never be able to provide an offer to an in-depth offer to all schools, and there will always be an element of need that will not be able to be addressed through what we're supporting. And we hope that the sort of strategic outreach is a way in which partnerships can take a look across the piece and come together and think through how they can address those gaps, and that we will have a kind of layering together of Uni Connect, provider outreach, third sector outreach and other things. But again, we will never be able to address all possible gaps and all possible need through a programme.
Thanks, Jenny. Okay, so another question here around target learners. Would all learners worked with at target schools identified count towards monitoring targets, or would they have to meet set markers of disadvantage, postcode or otherwise? Kirsty, did you want to come in on that one?
Yeah, sure. So when we identify the priority schools and colleges, we would expect then further sort of drilling down to identify and target sort of underrepresented groups of students. So that would be something that we would welcome your views on in the consultation, actually, of how prescriptive the OFS should be about the sort of further drilling down of targeting, but actually if the partnerships and the schools and colleges want to make those decisions themselves, it would need to be focused on underrepresented students, but any of those students that you engage with would contribute to the targeting, any sort of targeting KPMs that we have. So yeah, I think the answer is yes, but we wouldn't expect every student in that school necessarily to be engaged in the programme. It really depends on the funding levels and where the sort of priorities are within that school or college.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I'm going to have to draw this part of the session to an end because we are rapidly coming up to 4:30, and I just don't think that there will be sufficient time to answer a further question. We have had a very large number of questions, so thank you ever so much for your engagement with the session today. We haven't, as I anticipated and as I said at the beginning, we have not had the time to address all of the questions that you've asked. What we will do is that we will go through the questions that have been left unanswered, and we will try and address those thematically, and we will seek to put information to answer those questions up on the website. And as we said, we will also be publishing the recording of this event as well, so that you will be able to listen back, and your colleagues who were unable to attend today will also be able to listen back. So I do thank you ever so much for the engagement. The consultation is open until the 19th of January. So if you haven't yet, do please contribute to the consultation, respond to the consultation, and if you've done a partial response already, do please make sure that you can complete it. We are interested in hearing from all sorts of stakeholders, obviously the partnerships themselves, higher education providers, further education colleges, schools, but anybody that has an interest in this area. We are very, very keen to hear from you. We've had well over 500 responses already, so this is clearly something that that colleagues across the sector and other sectors are very, very interested in. So once again, thank you ever so much for your participation today. Thank you for all the questions. We will try and answer more of them for you. But I would like to say thank you very much, and hope you have a great rest of the week. Friday tomorrow, weekend coming, so have a restful weekend as well. Thank you very much, everybody, and thank you to Kirsty and to Jenny for their presentations, and to other OFS colleagues who've been in the background sorting out your questions and making sure that everything runs smoothly. So thank you to everybody there as well. Okay, that's it from us. So thank you very much, everybody.